The following content has been provided by RWTH Aachen University.
Going to get to the Apple Mac as sort of the thing that actually Apple was able to sell successfully in the market in 1984. And let me roll the video first here. It rolls immediately, I think. Does it or not? I think it does. This will be, among other things, the Mac was also known as having sort of the most successful commercial of all times. When you asked like advertising specialists, they said this was the best ad video that somebody ever made. So Apple early on sort of made their claim to not just having cool products, but also being really good at selling them. And this video was shown during the 1984 Super Bowl commercial break, which is, I think, the most expensive TV spot you can book on American TV. So the entire nation is glued to the TV and is seeing this. And this was the time when IBM had released its PC, taken away proceeds from Apple, who had been selling their Apple II for a couple of years until then. And IBM was also sort of Big Blue, right? It was like the commercial thing. And Apple, of course, played on that and sort of compared IBM to Big Brother. And because it was going to be 1984, and there is George Orwell's novel 1984 out there that proclaims Big Brother. So it was sort of a nice play on comparing IBM to Big Brother from Orwell. The video, by the way, was created by a certain director called Ridley Scott that some people might know. He also made the Alien movies, so obviously somebody who had a sense for the dramatic. And so this kind of sort of post-apocalyptic view here is also seen, where you see lots of basically minions of Big Brother being indoctrinated by the speech that Big Brother's holding. These are actually, the text is actually from George Orwell's 1984 that's being read there on the big screen in the video. And then, of course, the savior comes in the form of a very colorfully clad lady that smashes Big Brother to pieces. So let's watch that video. Okay. So obviously, this was also an early example of linking, and this is important, I think, linking computer technology to something more emotional, right? So to actually explain to people that these computers could be an important part of their lives. That was the idea, right? The PC for the rest of us, basically, who could, didn't feel like using technology, but we wanted to maybe draw or create nice invitations for our neighbors or something like this. Technically, the Apple Macintosh was at least a follow-up at a much reduced price point. The first commercially successful system, only $2,500. So that's a significant difference from a $10,000 Lisa or a $17,000 Alto or Star. It made the graphical user interface affordable to a huge new user community, and was not just targeted at office use, but actually at hobbyists, home users, just as well as people who were running small businesses. The other thing I think that is interesting about the Mac was that technically it had to take a lot of steps back, right, to become, be able to perform at the speed that they needed. Everything was being re-implemented. They were no longer running it on top of Smalltalk, because that's a great environment to write an OS and to run to write the software. But it was just not performant enough. So things dropped back to being written in Pascal back in the time. So a simple procedural language that compiled much more efficiently. MacPaint, for example, one of the things that that was sort of the graphics engine of the Macintosh operating system, is a wonderful example written by Bill Atkinson of very tightly written, highly performant code that was running on just a 68,000 CPU there, but really performing at interactive frame rates and with much improved responsiveness. Sorry. The story goes that Bill Atkinson once sort of improved his quick write routines with and sped up things dramatically, and then he filled in his productivity report saying productivity is minus 2,000 because I made things so much faster that there's much less work to do now. MacDraw and MacPaint and QuickDraw are actually, this happened fairly recently, now available as open source. You can actually see the source code of these sort of groundbreaking apps that were written to be very responsive with very little resources available. Here's apart from that, the other thing that the Mac is being remembered for is that it was probably to this day the most consistent commercially available graphical user interface. What do I mean by this? I mean that not only did Apple create this hardware platform and the operating system running on top of it and the key applications, but they also gave out a very, very consistent and clear style guide that said exactly how things are supposed to work. They sent out what they called evangelists that would go to developers who had no idea how to write graphical applications. They'd only been writing applications for maybe the Apple II or IBM PC and text-based applications. And they explained to them in workshops and in lots of documentation how to actually build good graphical user interface apps. That it's very different to write a graphical user interface application from writing a text-based one, because all of a sudden the user can click here and there and there. This thing has to be very responsive. You have to be able to drag and copy and paste between apps. All these things were completely new to people who had been writing basically text-based applications. So the system kind of looked like this. Not much surprise here on this. There were some limitations. Of course, you've got overlapping windows. We still have a cursor indicator that looks like that today, and the text cursor, in addition to the mouse cursor. You got your menu bar. You had, you could even adjust the speed with which your double click was being recognized. You could adjust how many blinks you want on your menu bar after you select something. We'll talk about this more in DIS2, where we'll also learn why although you've got multiple windows open here, this isn't actually, technically speaking, a modern preemptive multitasking system. That's also why it ran into performance problems some years later. The other thing that is kind of funny about the Mac is that's the Macintosh keyboard, the original Macintosh keyboard. Tell me what is missing. Say again? Numeric keyboard? Well, yeah, I don't have a numeric keyboard on my laptop. Yeah, yes, no arrow keys. Do you notice that? So there is something about Steve Jobs and arrow keys that has, there seems to be a problem there. But the point is here, why are there no arrow keys? There were no arrow keys, and Apple explained that later, because they wanted to force developers to change their software. If you put arrow keys on there, you could basically make a text-based interface where you would still navigate completely around lines and columns with your arrow keys and not using the mouse. And they wanted to force developers to adopt the new graphical interaction paradigm, use the mouse. That's why they didn't put arrow keys. Of course, users went crazy, right? Because if you don't have arrow keys and you actually want to write some text, you go nuts, right? You have to use special keyboard combinations to move your cursor or reach over to the mouse all the time. Now, and that's not effective, right? Does that remind anybody of a more recent product that had similar issues? Ever tried to move your cursor on like an iPhone, right? The iPhone keyboard also doesn't have cursor keys. Supposedly, an iPad, right? For the longest time, didn't have any because supposedly you're supposed to position your cursor with your finger, which is really tedious, right? But now, if you may have noticed this with like the latest iOS and the latest larger iPhone models, you actually do get cursor keys again to move your cursor. But again, it wasn't there in the beginning to make sure people would write applications, developers would write applications that really work with the multi-touch interface and that didn't just adopt a simple, in this case, GUI kind of, a keyboard-based input device. All right, we'll finish here for now. I think that's enough for the Mac today and for the history. We'll continue next week looking more into the future. Thank you.
This content was provided by RWTH Aachen University.